welcome everyone. Good early evening to those in Hong Kong and similar time zones. Good afternoon and good morning to those joining us from other places around the world. And welcome to tonight's or today's book talk hosted by the Transnational Legal History Group, part of the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law here at CUHK LAW. Today's discussion will be on the book Going the Distance, Eurasian Trade and the Rise of the Business Corporation, 1400 to 1700. Our presenter today is Professor Von Harris, who we are immensely fortunate to have with us. Professor Harris is the Kalman Lubowsky Professor of Law and History and the past Dean of the School of Law at Tel-Aviv University. In addition to the work he will present today, he is the author of many other important works, including Industrializing English Law, Entrepreneurship and Business Organization, 1720 to 1844. And he is currently working on a book project on the expansion of company law and multinational corporations from Britain to its empire, with particular attention to the period between 1844 and 1914. Across his work, and one reason it is such a privilege to have him with us here today, Professor Harris combines expertise in national and international areas of law, including corporate law and international trade law in particular, with deep knowledge of economic history, making for an unusually broad and deep command of what are in many ways, I think, distinct bodies of literature. An interdisciplinary command that, in my humble view at least, makes his work particularly valuable as we reflect on the significance of the law, in particular in relationship to historical causality generally, and in relationship to the development of different forms of socio-political order and institutional organization over time and so forth. So, today, Professor Harris will speak for around 45 minutes. After that, as usual, I will open the floor to questions and discussion. As always, we're very interested in having a vibrant discussion. So please, if you have any questions, please send them in to me using the chat function during the talk. I know it can be hard to type out questions. I always have a really hard time doing that. If you would like to, if you would like me to unmute you so you can ask your question directly, please just send me a message to that effect and I will add your name to the queue. And it's always nice to have to hear some voices directly. For everyone's information, I think you got this via the Zoom itself. This event will be recorded and posted on CUHK's website. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with colleagues, it will in short order be available there as well. Without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Professor Harris.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm just sharing my slides. I would like to make sure that everybody can see them. Are they visible? Excellent. So I would like to thank you, Chris, for the invitation, and I would like to thank Barney for organizing this event and for the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law, the Transnational Legal History Group, for hosting this event and creating this opportunity for me to present my book, which came out just last year by Princeton University Press. I gave some months ago a talk about the book in the quantitative history seminar in another university in Hong Kong. If any of you have attended that talk, I will, from the start, say that the emphasis, the focus of my talk here would be somewhat different, because my assumption there was that I'm talking mostly to economic historians, and my assumption here is that I'm talking mostly to legal historians and people that are interested in comparative law and legal transplants and things like this. So accordingly, I present different parts of the project today than the ones I've emphasized last time. As Chris has mentioned, I'm working for some time now, ever since my dissertation, in fact, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on the history of business organizations, with particular emphasis on the history of the business corporation. I've published a book on the history of the business corporation during the Industrial Revolution in Britain. This book takes us to an earlier period. some other projects of mine over the years took us to a later period, 19th and early 20th century. And I'm now working on the book project mentioned by Chris, which is tentatively titled Empire Limited, a project I'm working on for the last 2-3 years. And I hope to have an opportunity to present some of the progress I'm making in this project in Hong Kong as well, for the reason that Hong Kong features in that project much more prominently than in the current project. The current project is Eurasian. The new project is focused on the British Empire and the commercial hubs of the empire, such as Hong Kong, are important, and Hong Kong as a basis for doing business in Shanghai and other parts of China plays an important part in my understanding of company law in the empire and its extension from the empire to the informal empire. So that's a different project I'll be talking about on a different opportunity. So my research questions, I begin by kind of presenting the overview argument of the book and then focus on 2 themes, interrelated themes. So the questions I started with this were first, what was the role of long distance trade in the creation, the initial design, the features, the attributes, and the later future of the business corporation? That is, for me, long distance trade was where the business corporation was born. So I was trying to study in this project, why was the business corporation born in long distance trade, primarily long distance Eurasian trade, and what were the attributes that were attached to the business corporation because of this environment or this type of business activity, long distance trade. The second question I started off with is, what is the role of the business corporation in Eurasian trade? And in fact, when you expand it beyond Eurasian trade, in global trade altogether, because it seems as though the appearance of the business corporation, the very first business corporations, the English and Dutch East India companies, more or less coincided with the taking over of the Cape Route by the Europeans and the formation of the first global trade network that covers everywhere from the Americas to India and China, and from the Americas across the Pacific Ocean into Manila and Japan and China. So the business corporation was there when the great divergence in terms of trade, at least, not industry, but trade, was created. So my question was, what was the role of the business corporation as compared to other factors that could have brought about this divergence in who dominates long distance trade, or how long is long distance trade, and why do Western Europeans dominate it? So these are the 2 questions I started off with. And my answer to them in this order is that, in fact, what was going on around 1600, around the involvement of British and Dutch merchants in long distance trade, particularly Cape Route long distance trade to India and beyond, amounted for what I term an organizational revolution. It was a turning point in the history of business organizations, a turning point from an era, a long era, in which organization relied upon personal connections. Personal connections could be anything from, let's say, family connections to connections among co-religioners or members of the same town or members of the same ethnic group. Everything was based on some level of personal familiarity and the kind of trust that is being generated by this familiarity. I will not analyze here how exactly trust is being generated by personal connections, but I think that the intuition is quite strong about this. So this was a turning point, not just one more option that was added to the menu, but rather an option that is fundamentally different from every other option that was on the menu up until around 1600, in personal collaboration among hundreds and even thousands of people that did not know each other beforehand. And also that many of the attributes that we associate today with the business corporation were created at this period. These attributes amount to the organizational revolution. So for this kind of argument, which is focused on the period, let's say 1600 to 1700, I had to go back and start following the history of the business corporation from its origins in the Roman Catholic Church. I then tried to see how did this formative period of the 17th century affect the later history of the business corporation. Obviously, I did not study the later period. My endpoint was 1700, which saved me the need to address later developments, but I am familiar with later developments from my other research, so I could see how these periods lead to the next one. And ultimately, this is the formative period for understanding what's going on in the world today, which is a world dominated by the corporate economy. Corporations dominate the global economy in any parameter one could think of, from numbers of employees, revenues, profits, or whatever, and they match up with mid-sized political states, territorial states. The second the second argument is that the organizational revolution was also crucial for the taking over of long-distance trade by England and the Dutch Republic. It's not just Europeans or Western Europeans in general. It was specifically the English and the Dutch that took over a long-distance trade. And my argument that the organizational revolution, organizational factors, legal factors played a very important role in this taking over of Eurasian trade, Cape Route trade, Eurasian trade, and global trade by the English and the Dutch. And my argument, which is debatable, is that the organizational factors were more important than technological or military factors. Let me just shut my window. There is some noise coming out. I hope that you'll hear me better now. So this is the second argument, maybe somewhat more controversial, somewhat more debatable in the literature, in the reviews that I've already received, but I nevertheless insist on making it. So what I am arguing here is that the creation of the global trade system that involved all continents but Asia, Australia, sorry, was created around the year 1600, and to a large extent, thanks to that organizational revolution in the way in which corporations have functioned. And what we see here is not, as I said, just the rise of Europe to dominance in the longest distance trade. I'm not arguing that Europe took over all of Eurasian trade. The shorter the trade, the more likely it was to be dominated by local or regional merchants in various parts of Asia. The longer the trade, the more likely it was to be dominated by Europeans, but not just Europeans of every sort. What you see here in the red is Portuguese ships going around the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese led the way in the first century of Cape Route trade, but then the English and the Dutch in the blue took over. So my argument is that it's not Europeans, but rather those Europeans that were able to use the joint stock business corporation in an effective way are the ones that took over the Cape Route trade to Asia. And in order to address this question, I had to go back in time, several centuries in time, in order to understand how was trade organized before the arrival of the Europeans, how Chinese, Indians, Arabs, other Muslims organized their long-distance trade, then to follow the first Europeans to be in Asia, which was primarily the Portuguese of the 16th century, and only then try to understand what's going on in the 17th century with the English and the Dutch. In order to understand this, I couldn't settle for oceanic trade. I had to understand what's going on in overland trade as well, in what's commonly called the Silk Road or the Silk Route, and some other routes in Eurasia, overland routes in Eurasia, because land trade was always an alternative to sea trade. I had to understand how different civilizations have played in this trade, what were the connections between them, and what has changed. And what I can already say that has changed is that if up until the arrival of the Europeans, and primarily the Dutch and the English, trade was mostly regional, one sphere kind of interacted and traded with a nearby sphere. What we see as the English and the Dutch show up, they bypass the entire system of cross-regional trade and offer kind of a Eurasian trade around the Cape of Good Hope. So this is the how trade looked like before the arrival of the Cape Route traders, and things have changed dramatically. I also have to cover the full range of organizational options that were on the menu. I cannot focus just on the business corporation. I had to understand what were the alternatives to the business corporation, how trade was organized before the arrival or the formulation of the business corporation. And I followed everything from peddlers and traveling agents to state-run trade and the corporation itself. I also had to deal with alternative or competing explanations for the rise to dominance of the Western Europeans in Eurasian trade, such as superior shipbuilding technology or superior navigational technology or navigational knowledge, superior weapon usage, or particularly weapons upon ships, having a cannon on the ground and a cannon on a ship dock is a different type of exercise, and also the willingness to use violence, because one of the leading arguments is that the Europeans were willing to use violence more than others, that others preferred to do business peacefully, whereas the Europeans were willing to use force. So I had at some point to deal with all of these explanations. Maybe I'll address them at the Q&A stage, not at this stage. So this is what I had to kind of do in order to answer the second question. In terms of the theory I have approached the project with, I kind of mapped the theories that were used in previous generations to address Eurasian trade. Obviously, I'm not the first one to try and make sense of Eurasian trade. So there were what one could call Smithian frameworks that emphasized the expansion and integration of markets and the benefits that could be gained by specialization, regional specialization. There were Marxian or Marxist frameworks that paid attention to the accumulation of capital and to the exploitation of the proletariat. There were Brudelian frameworks that were popular in the middle of the 20th century and beyond it, after World War II, that paid attention to the environment, to the long duration and things like this. There were Weberian approaches, which are the closest to mine in many senses, that paid attention to motivation, to rational thinking, to rational calculability of profits and things like this. So I found this not sufficiently informative for my purpose, on the one hand. On the other hand, I had the sense that what's called the new institutional economics has much to offer theoretically that was not yet utilized in this context and for addressing the kind of research questions I'm interested in. So I gained insights from new institutional economics. I did not exactly build formal models. I did not exactly run a quantitative econometric regressions, but I nevertheless use new institutional economics and organizational theory that is growing out of the new institutional economics. And I'll explain, if I'll be asked, what exactly was the role of theory in my project. I also used insights from legal history and comparative law, and I was trying to kind of expand the theory of institutional migration and legal migration. I found that legal transparent literature not sufficiently informative for my needs, and was trying to push it forward, and then gain use some of the insights I gained from this theoretical exercise. So anyway, so this is kind of what I was trying to do in the project. These are the main arguments. Why did long distance trade attract me? Because for me, in many respects, long distance trade is the organizational cutting edge, or the institutional cutting edge, if we were still using the institutional kind of terminology. It is in this period, kind of in the pre-modern to early modern period, the type of business activity that was most challenging, highest uncertainties, highest risks, highest investment thresholds, highest asymmetric information and most augmented agency problems, if we use the kind of terms that are being used in these theories. So, and the reasons for this, I think, are clear. The distances are the longest. There is no single legal jurisdiction that controls the entire interaction. Different rulers can expropriate, can expel, or what have you. There are pirates on sea, and there are robbers on land. And there is, on the other hand, very high prospect of profitability. So you have to somehow try to aspire as a contemporary merchant, try to aspire for the profitability that will increase the longer the trade is, because the price differences are the largest, the furthest you go. How to achieve this while reducing the risks, reducing the problems created by employing agents and things like this. So this is the the organizational cutting edge. I like to use the example of outer space activities at the moment. You can see that there are experiments now with different types of organizational models for making out of space voyages to other planets in our solar system, and maybe later also voyages out into our galactic or beyond it. So you can see as one model NASA, you can see as another model SpaceX, and there are various combinations around, in between and around these. So long distance trade for me is what outer space voyages are today. This is why it is most interesting to me. So now, in the rest of my talk, I would like to focus on two related themes that I think will be of interest to the group here today, because I'm talking to lawyers today. So the interrelated themes are connected to questions of legal migration, legal transplantation, legal importation, legal circulation. There are various terms that shift around. I usually use the term migration in this book. And the questions are as follow. First of all, did different Eurasian regions use similar or different organizational forms? As much as they use similar forms, were these similar forms invented, so to speak, independently in different regions? Or did one region kind of import or mimic a solution from another region in Eurasia? That is, one option is that it was created spontaneously, independently in different parts of Eurasia. The other option is that a solution was invented in one place and traveled around Eurasia by learning in different types of learning of organizational know-how. And there are obviously options in between the two. And once we and the other kind of point of gravity of my question in this, with respect to this theme, as much as you see different organizational solutions in different parts of Eurasia, what should one infer on or conclude from this? One answer is that the different solutions were better suited for different regions and different environments and different regions and different motivations. That is, the organizational forms were different because of some fundamental differences between the regions. The other hypothesis or potential explanation is that the differences do not result from this. One region in potential could learn and mimic a solution from another region that could suit that region. That is, the problems are similar enough, the challenges are similar enough, and nevertheless there is no importation and no migration, and there is no importation or no migration because of some sort of an obstacle that prevents the migration of the institutional know-how or the specific institution. Okay, so two different observations of what's going on. And then for each observation, one could provide different explanations. So another advantage of the project I selected is that as I understand the project, this is a natural experiment in the sense that everybody was trying to do the same thing. Everybody was trying to trade with the same goods within the same environment of the South China Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Ocean at large, the Arabia Sea, everybody, and maybe also around the Cape of Good Hope, which is a question, which has to be followed by a question mark. So the environment was the same, the goods were the same, the nature of the trade was the same. So the hypothesis should be that the needs were the same, and as much as we find differences, we have to explain this difference not by different needs, but by some other explanation. Obviously, this is not a perfect natural experiment. There are some deviations from it, and we can talk about it again in the Q&A. So I kind of created, while working on the project, 3 prototypes. The first one is of what I call an indigenous, endemic, multiply invented organizational solutions. The second prototype is of an institution that was invented in one specific place, but then traveled widely around Eurasia. And the third prototype is of an institution that was created in one part of Eurasia, one region of Eurasia, and nevertheless did not travel around. As every prototype, these prototypes do not reflect reality in its fullness. Reality is more complex than any prototype. And secondly, when you're talking about the third prototype, when I'm talking about a resistance to migration, I do not mean that resistance lasted for eternity. So if resistance lasted for 300 years, as was the case with the business corporation, I put it in prototype number 3 rather than 2. And these distinctions between 2 and 3 are somewhat arbitrary, because if you look at a long enough term, you'll find business corporations everywhere. But my argument is that even today, when you look at business corporations, they're not all the same. Let's say, not all of the business corporations one see in India or in China function similarly to business corporations as we see them in Britain today or the US. So it's not necessarily the case that the business corporation have spread in its fullness globally by now. It first definitely migrated in its formal form globally, but not necessarily in its full context so far. So these are the 3 prototypes that I'm using in order to give sense and address my research questions related to the theme I'm developing today of institutional migrations. And so in the talk today, I will not talk about the first type of institutions, the ones that migrated freely. The ones that were created in many places in Eurasia. I'm not talking today about family firms, even though one could find family firms, and I discuss family firms in China, in Gujarat, India, in the Islamic Middle East, and in Europe. One could find family firms everywhere. They were created organically out of families, usually out of extended families that were the norm in most of Eurasia throughout much of the history. But there are variations that I'm kind of skipping today. If we look at partnerships, what we call today general partnerships, I think that we'll find partnerships also widely in Eurasia. And there is no reason to believe that the partnership model was copied from one place to the other. It is more likely that partnerships were intuitively created in different parts of Eurasia. That's very hard to prove an argument methodologically, but nevertheless, I kind of risk the statement that partnerships were created in various parts of Eurasia. The employment of agents, of peddlers are also kind of type 1 institutions in my terminology. I will not talk about this today. I'll devote much of my talk to type 2 institutions, and particularly to the C loan and the commander, the ones that were created in one place and migrated. And in the last part of the talk, I talk about type 3 institutions, that is business corporations, and particularly the Dutch and the English business corporations, Dutch and English East India companies. And I'll try to explain why the C loan and the commander migrated while the corporation did not migrate in my period. And I'll also try to explain the differences in the path of migration of the C loan and the commander. When did they migrate differently in Eurasia, to different parts of Eurasia? So that's the rest of the talk. So once presenting this typology, the first question that might come to mind for you is, how do I know whether an institution I kind of encounter is type 1, type 2, or type 3 institution? And particularly kind of distinguishing type 1 from type 2 is very hard. Because you see, the observation is similar, and nevertheless, you have to distinguish. You see them everywhere, but nevertheless, you have to distinguish, why do I think that the commander is a type 2, whereas the partnership is type 1? So there is a methodological problem here. And I've used a few methodological tools in order to untangle, try to distinguish one from the other. I was trying to track migration routes, either through direct evidence or some speculation. I was trying to identify migratory agents who could take the organizational know-how from one place to the other. I was also looking for abrupt change or abrupt birth of a new institution. It's more likely that abrupt creation reflects an invention, whereas a gradual adoption reflects some sort of a diffusion of knowledge from one place to the other. It's not a kind of a fully proof distinguisher. I was looking obviously for similarities. This is what we always do when we do comparison, even in a standard comparative law. We want to see how similar are things. And kind of just to kind of motivate the rest of the discussion, when we look, this type of migration is much more challenging in these respects than migration from above as we see it in imperial and colonial contexts. Because in the project I'm working on now, the British Empire, one could see how similar is the Companies Act of India to that of England, or of Mandate Palestine of 1929 to English Act of 1929. You can actually compare the texts. In my exercise, there is no such evidence, conclusive evidence. So I'm looking for similarities in the details. Let's say the commander, I'll show you in a couple of minutes. The general idea of the commander is one, but the details can either be similar or different. And again, doctrinal similarities. It's not only in the organizational form, but also in the legal doctrine that surrounds it. Then what could definitely complicate things, and often complicated things, was the fact that the migration did not always mean a migration of the full organizational form. Sometimes it meant it was done on a more abstract, more general level. That is, the idea that one could split profit between, let's say, a financier and a traveling merchant could travel as an abstract idea without the full details of the commander. And how, so how do you look for migration on this level, and what do you do when you don't know whether there was a migration on this level or not? And then one last kind of distinguisher is to see to what extent was not only the form similar, but also the function. Let's say if the same form is being used in overland trade in one place and maritime trade in another place, what do we make of this? And I've also developed kind of a theoretical hypothesis for the question, how likely is an organizational solution to migrate, or how likely is law in general to migrate? And here you can see on the left-hand side, those are less factors that might reduce the likelihood of migration. On the right-hand side, factors that might increase the likelihood of migration. First of all, the more civilization embedded is the law or the organizational form or the institution, the less likely it is to migrate, because you have to separate it. And then it might not fit the different location, let's say, in terms of its religion or political order or its culture. Sometimes an organizational solution can function well only with complementary institutions or an environment that contains additional elements. Let's say, could the corporation function without a stock exchange or not? It will be a question we'll be dealing with. So sometimes you have to import a cluster of institutions, because if you import only one of those institutions, it won't be able to function. Also, the more complex an institution is, the less likely it is to migrate. And as much as it will end up migrating, it's more likely that some general notion, some general abstract idea of what the institution does will migrate rather than the full details, because many details are not easily transferable. So all of this led me to kind of the hypothesis that family firms are likely to migrate, corporations are less likely to migrate, and C loans and commenda will be somewhere in between. So as I said, I won't talk about family firms today. I'll talk about C loans and commenda, and then about corporations. And the C loan and the commenda were both created in the Mediterranean, as much as we know historically, around the Mediterranean, not necessarily within the Mediterranean Sea, maybe along its coast, in different periods in the history, kind of in antiquity, or maybe or the latest, the early Middle Ages. There are a variety of organizational forms that circulated around the Middle East and the Eastern and the Mediterranean from pre-Athenian period into the Greek period, the Roman period, Byzantine period, the Middle Ages, the revival of trade in Italy, which are the periods that are being covered here. Different organizational forms. Some of them are based on fixed pay, say the C loan. Some of them are based on splitting of profits, like the commenda, and there are some additional forms. I won't get into all of the details. The two in kind of squares in yellow here are the maritime loan and the commenda. The maritime loan was probably created for the first time in the Phoenician Eastern Mediterranean, in the Phoenician Levant. There are some evidence of its existence, let's say some ports in modern day Lebanon. Then we see it in Athens, then we see it in Roman law, then we see it elsewhere in the Mediterranean, in the Byzantine Empire, in Constantinople, and in the Italian ports of the revival of trade, Venice, Genoa, and other, Pisa, and some other ports. The kirad, as much as we know, was first created not in Greek times, not in Roman times, but rather around the rise of Islam and in Arabia. It apparently first was used in overland trade and then moved around to Italy, other parts of the Middle East, other parts of the Mediterranean, other parts of the Middle East and beyond. So I'm talking about these two. These are only two of a multiplicity of organizational forms that are being covered in the book. What is the C loan? This is kind of one of the very first kind of evidence for the existence of a C loan. The C loan tried to address risks at sea, risks of the loss of ships or the loss of cargo that had to be thrown jettisoned out of ships during storms and things, or escape from pirates and things like this. What we can see in this is that many ships have sunk in the Mediterranean. The more ships have sunk, the more trade was intensive. We know there are many shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, so loss of ships and cargo at sea was a risk high on the agenda at the time. And the solution that has developed, as I portrayed, beginning with the Phoenicians, moving to the Greeks and the Roman and the Byzantine and the Italians, was kind of having an element of risk allocation in loan transactions. That is, the lender lends money to the merchant has to repay the money, but only if the ship arrives safely. If not, it does not have to repay. That is, the lender assumes the sea risk, which allows the merchant to assume higher risks in his business life. So this is the sea loan. The sea loan, interestingly, as I already indicated, traveled around the Mediterranean, but not into the Islamic law, world, for reasons I'll explain momentarily. So this is the migration path of the sea loan, westwards, but not eastwards. As much as it arrived eastwards, it was with merchants, particularly Portuguese merchants that used it in modern day Indonesia and the Philippines and Japan. It did not travel through Islam, by Islam or through Islam. The commander, as I said, is an organizational solution that was invented later on. It is a more complicated transaction. Those of you who are familiar with a limited partnership will recognize the commander as the forebearer of the limited partnership. You have two partners, but there is a total asymmetry between two partners. One invests money, capital, goods. The other invests labor and travels. And at the end of the day, they split the profits. It's not a fixed payment like the sea loan. It's an equity investment with a splitting of profits, 3/4 and a quarter, 2/3 and a third in different schemes. And there is a question of who bears the liability for which loss, which I will not get into here. It's quite complicated. We can see that initially sea loans dominated Italian Mediterranean trade, and over time, Comenda became more popular than sea loans. You can see the gray, the lighter gray is sea loans, the darker gray near in black is the Comenda. This is one observation. There are many other observations. The trend is not, we cannot establish the trend for the entire Mediterranean. We don't have the records. So now the Comenda traveled much more widely than the sea loan. It began in Arabia, not in the ancient world, but rather in early Islamic Arabia. It traveled to Italy, probably with the revival of trade, with the Crusaders, maybe with the Islamic conquest of Sicily and southern Italy, maybe with the Islamic conquest of Spain, much of Spain. There were some encounters with Islam through which the commander traveled to Europe. In Europe, it traveled widely across the Mediterranean to southern France and Spain, across the Alps to northern Europe, into the Baltic in a different form, into England, having to adjust to the common law. But it also traveled eastward with the expansion of Islam to Persia, to Central Asia, to India, and probably beyond. One could find a commander in Armenian, among Armenian merchants. One could find something which is a bit similar to the commander and could have been imported from the original Islamic Curado commander among Mongolian rulers and traveling merchants, the Otoi. So this is how the commander migrated, much different, much wider than the sea loan. The commander took somewhat different shape in different parts of, let's say, in Islam and Italy. And the question I was trying to address is why the sea loan migrated much more in a more confined way than the commander. And this is the last slide of this theme, and then I'll talk briefly about business cooperation. So one explanation is theological. Islam was against usury. But apparently not only Islam was against usury. All of the three monotheistic religions, based on some sentences in the old Jewish Bible, were against usury. But the prohibition on usury was somewhat different in Islam and in Christianity. Maybe the differences made some difference. Secondly, Islamic trade was mostly overland because of the geographic of expansion of Islam. So the sea loan was not really well functioning in overland trade. There was no sinking ships there. And this could be an explanation. Another explanation is that the commander showed up in Islam very early on. By the 7th, 8th century, one could use commander and did not use the sea, did not need the sea loan. Another explanation is that while the sea loan was recognized by Roman law, was legitimized by Roman law, and all of those who thought highly of Roman law were willing to entertain the sea loan to some extent. But Roman law did not serve any legitimizing role within Islam. So this role could not support the sea loan in Islam. And lastly, Islamic regions were typified by large non-Islamic minorities. And the prohibition on usury applied only to Muslims. So in a way, non-Muslims could provide loans bearing interest or could borrow with interest. So the non-Muslims could do what the Muslims could not do in this respect. There were no such minorities in Latin Europe. There were no significant Islamic minorities in Latin Europe. So these are my explanations for why the sea loan did not migrate. Why did the commander migrate? First of all, it did not conflict with usury bans because it was about profit splitting rather than interest payment. Secondly, the commander did not originate in Roman law. So for the Muslims, having the commander did not mean adopting Roman law. The commander could more easily serve both overland trade and maritime trade, unlike the sea loan. And the commander had no close substitutes. As much as the sea loan had substitute in the form of the commander in Islam, the commander did not have a substitute, let's say, in Latin Europe or in any other part of Eurasia. So all of this led me to the explanation why the commander traveled more widely than the sea loan. Even though both are type 2 institutions, the commander is a type 2 institution that migrated more widely than the sea loan. One important lesson that I gained by this exercise is that migration is often embedded with transformation, change. You do not adopt the institution exactly as you found it in the other region or the other religion or the other civilization. You transform the institution in order, first of all, to legitimize its acceptance. You try to present it as a domestic, as a local institution rather than a foreign one. You do it firstly by changing the name, but you're also trying to fit it into the general framework of your law. Let's say the Italians tried to fit the Islamic Kirad when they transformed it into a commander to Roman law, to find some Roman law sources that would kind of legitimize and substantiate the functioning of the commander. And you can see the same in other places. The Armenians, when they adopt the commander, probably for Muslim traders, tried to show that it had Christian roots rather than Muslim roots. You also had to adjust it to local environments. One example is moving it from overland to maritime uses. The Kirad used mostly for overland, the commander mostly for maritime trade. Some adjustment had to be made. Adjustment had to be made also to the level of literacy and the use of written documents and different account books, and written account books between different regions. Not everything could be used orally, that could be used in a written form. And there are other factors. So all of these factors complicated us methodologically, because you observe two things that intentionally were made to look different, and nevertheless you have to conclude that they are of the same origin, or that one kind of imported it from another place. So this is definitely a challenge that connects our substantive findings and explanations to our methodological challenges. Now, I'll briefly, I don't know how many minutes do I have, I'll briefly go through the cooperation. So now we are moving from an era in which Eurasian trade was mostly in the Indian Ocean and overland, which was the case up to, let's say, 1500, to an era in which the Europeans go westwards into the ocean and then southwards in the ocean. This is a very familiar map from 1492. It's a bit confusing at first sight. Something is missing in this map. It will take us a moment to realize that the Americas are missing in this map. Even though it's 1492, the very famous map drawer did not draw the Americas because he did not know about Columbus's voyage yet and its implications. Once you move from this worldview into this worldview, you realize that in order to get to Asia, you have to go around the Cape. You cannot aspire to get easily to Asia by just going westwards from Europe. You have to go southwards. You will never reach China and India if you just go westwards because you'll stumble the Americas. So the Europeans started going southward up until the moment in which they discovered the Cape route. It was not easy because of they got into parts of the southern hemisphere they did not know. The star layout is different, the currents are different, the winds are different. Even in the South Atlantic, definitely once you get into the Indian Ocean. So once you get there, the distances of getting there are very different. Going from Lisbon to Guangzhou is maybe how many times? 9 times longer than just the longest European voyage before the discovery of the Cape route in the Americas. And it is much longer, like 3 times longer than Columbus's voyage to America. So we are getting into a new exercise in terms of voyages, in terms of long distance trade. Risks are also high. Many ships are being lost in the Atlantic. Ships are being lost also in the Indian Ocean, South China Sea. The map that we have portrayed here is just being augmented. Risks are even higher. Longevity required is longer. Asymmetry is more prominent, etc., etc. So now the Europeans faced new challenges once they got into the longest trade they ever tried to be involved in. And these new challenges posed challenges to the organizational forms and gave birth to the business corporation. What you can see here is a transition from what was in existence in England at the time, which was called the regulated corporation, which in fact was a guild, into the joint stock corporation, which is a corporation that is involved in the business by itself. The guild or the regulated corporation provides only the infrastructure. Each member trades by him on his own account at its own risks. Here, the corporation is the trader. So this is the transformation, the organizational revolution that I'm talking about. I cannot go through it quickly. So the basic building block was created a few centuries earlier in the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church gave rise to the concept of legal personality, legal entity, a legal notion that was not familiar to the Romans, a legal notion that was not familiar to any other legal system I'm aware of at the time. My explanation for the need of creating the legal personality within the context of the Roman Catholic Church is because the Roman Catholic Church is unique in the combination of 2 factors that did not exist anywhere in tandem. One of them is that the Roman Catholic Church was highly hierarchical, a religious order with the Pope at the center and delegation of powers It was not kind of a pluralistic, diffused religion, but rather a hierarchical religion. And secondly, it was an hierarchical religion that did not want to rely on territorial rulers, emperors, kings, or things like this. The church wanted to separate itself from any kind of emperor or king. For these two purposes, the Royal Catholic Church has the Roman Catholic Church has invented the corporation as a conception in canon law and as a tool of governance for its internal affairs. So this is where things have started. And from the Roman Catholic Church, the legal personality is expanded into various semi-public and public entities in Europe, municipal corporations, religious corporations, educational corporations, guilds, regulated corporations. So the corporate entity was in use for several centuries, was a pre-existing building block that was available only in Europe, but not anywhere else in Eurasia, because of things that are not related to long-distance trade, but rather to the Roman Catholic Church. And then we take it from here to the rest of our story, which is the joint stock business corporations. As I say, the Roman Catholic Church was centralized, hierarchical, and a corporation was, at the end of the day, in fact, the constitutional order, the constitutional system of the Roman Catholic Church. It was adapted to different uses over time. If you look at the list of royal charters in England over a couple of centuries, we see that the way in which corporations could be created in England was monopolized by the king. Only in England, only the kings could create corporations, and the corporations that were created initially were mostly of the type I portrayed so far: municipal corporation, educational, universities, colleges, schools, hospitals. Some guild-like livery companies, until we reached the East India Company in 1600. And this is the turning point. We have the Turkey Company before, which is a predecessor of the Russia Company, which is a predecessor. But this is the real turning point. What's going on here? The first business corporation, joint stock business corporations were created in England and the Dutch Republic within a span of 2 years. What had to be solved, and this is the explanation why only England and the Dutch Republic had real functioning East India companies for a while. What had to be solved is what I call dual credibility problem. The first problem is the ability of the ruler to convey to the incorporators and investors that their money will not be expropriated or heavily taxed. And the second was the credibility of the insiders, those who initiated and incorporated the company, the credibility of their commitment not to expropriate the other investors, not to cheat, not to steal, not to divert profits only to the pockets of these insiders. So these two had to be solved, these two problems. These two problems were solved not only by issuing of charters, because charters are just pieces of paper. The charters had to be indeed credible commitments, and both in England and the Dutch Republic, the charters were not just pieces of paper because of the way in which the constitutional structure of the two countries were formed by this time. What I call a nascent rule of law emerged in both of these already before 1600. In the case of England, it's the parliament, the independent judiciary, the clustering of vested interests. All of these amounted to the development of a nascent rule of law, which meant that if the king would like to ignore his commitment in a charter to form a corporation and let it operate without too heavily taxing it or expropriating its money or its goods, a rule of law had to be created. Otherwise, commitments with an absolute king, commitments have no value. And the next stage, together with this, was the raising of capital from passive investors from the public, what we call today IPOs, initial public offerings, were taking place in both the Dutch Republic and Britain. And the people who signed up for this and invested in the company were sufficiently reassured that the system would support them rather than cheat or expropriate them. The organizational revolution amounts to number 3 to 6 in this table. 1 and 2 were already in existence before 1600, were created in the context of the Roman Catholic Church and the universities and the municipalities. 3 to 6 were created in this period around the two East India companies: joint stock equity finance, lock-in of his investment, transferability of interest, that is not only initial public offering, but secondary market for the shares, and protection from expropriation by the ruler, which number 6 is something that did not exist in other parts of Europe for quite a long period of time. Number 7, asset partitioning or limited liability, in my understanding, was developed much later. I won't touch it today. So we have these two models. They are different from each other. I will not expand on the differences between the two for the lack of time. I'll just say that both of them at the end of the day provided longevity of existence beyond the life of any human being, delegated governance, the pooling of assets for many passive investors on impersonal basis. You do not have to know someone in order to invest. The spreading of risks among hundreds of thousands of investors. Some level of solution to agency problems, to information flow problems. And also, very important, separation between the business corporation and the state. They are not one and the same. The business corporation was not just an organ of the state, as was, let's say, the French or the Spanish business corporations, or let's see, some voyages in China or other parts of the globe. So once we see East India companies in other parts of Europe, we have to ask ourselves, are there really joint stock business corporations that fulfill the attributes I've mentioned? My argument that the answer is no. The Portuguese and French East India companies have failed because the kings, the Habsburg king and the French king could not credibly convey, because they were absolute kings, could not credibly convey not to expropriate. So only they and the families and relatives invested in these companies, no one else invested. Other joint East India companies in Europe were very small and were in fact used by English industry investors as bypasses to prohibitions to form additional companies in their countries, but they are insignificant in our story. As I say, commitment is essential. The existence of stock markets is also essential as a complementary institution to the joint stock business corporation. The corporations could not function without functioning stock market infrastructures. I'll kind of run quickly through this slide and will be willing to answer more questions in this respect later on. The question is now, why didn't the corporation travel to other parts of Europe and other parts of Eurasia for at least 2-3 centuries? And the quick answer is, outside of Europe, there were no legal personalities because there were no canon law and no Roman Catholic Church. So the basic business block was missing anywhere outside of Latin Europe. Secondly, most other countries in Europe and outside of Europe did not convey credible commitment, did not have stock exchanges. And also the demand in other parts of Eurasia was much lower for a long period of time. Indian merchants did very well without the corporation because they were centrally located. They dominated trade east and west from India. Chinese merchants also for a while were doing very well. Persian merchants did well. So it's not only that they did not have the building blocks or the institutional constitutional environment, but they also did not need this solution for a very long period of time because they got sufficiently well with other means such as family firms, merchant networks, ruler-operated trade. By the time they realized that they are inferior to the Europeans in terms of doing long-distance trade, it was too late for them to adopt the business corporation. And at the end of the day, they adopted it under the dominance of Europe in the late 19th century. So these are the 3 prototypes I started with my second part of the talk. The sea loan and the command are here. The corporation is here for the reasons I've explained. the Europeans, for a long period of time, were the only ones to go around the Cape of Good Hope. Despite some fiction that argues differently, we don't really know of any Chinese ship that arrived at the Thames or at the Americas. Only the Europeans dominated this. Among the Europeans, those that dominated trade were the corporate English and Dutch Republic. And as I said, my argument is that number 5 is a significant explanation, maybe not the only explanation, but a significant explanation for the taking over of the Cape route by the European, of the end of trade by the English and the Dutch. And also, this story is an important component of explaining how did we get into the corporate economy as we know it today. So I'll stop here. I ran a bit over time, but I apologize, and I'll take questions as they come. Thanks.
So thank you so much for that incredibly stimulating and wide-ranging talk. We have a bunch of, I should say, the question and answer session is now open for the audience. I have a bunch of, I have some questions already on the queue, but please send me a message. Let me know if you would like to be added to the queue. I will kick us off just by asking, I think, Professor Harris, you mentioned earlier on in your talk, I think if I've got the claim right, that you're making, it's more or less the organizational revolution in the form of the corporation and so forth was crucial to the rise and in particular dominance of European trade and the trade from particular, the Dutch and the British in particular. But you mentioned sort of some resistance to that on the part of others, some pushback, some other theories. So maybe just to get us started, could you lay out sort of what the resistance is, what the other theories are, and why you think you've got the better of the argument?
Yeah, it's very hard to quantify different factors that compete for being the leading explanation. So I answer it in two ways. First of all, when I got into studying the trade in Asia before the arrival of the Europeans, and navigation in Asia, shipbuilding in Asia, I got a sense that the advantage was there, not in Europe. That is, shipping technology was more superior. Asians knew how to find their way in the Indian Ocean, wherever they wanted to go. They could, except for the Cape of Good Hope, they did not aspire to cross because they didn't see any value in doing this. I think in Asia, they did very well. When the Europeans arrived in Asia, they were disadvantaged rather than advantaged in all of those technological and know-how respects. And you can see it. And generally speaking, I think that they were less developed in many respects. And particularly once you see how well adapted are the different technologies and know-hows to the Indian Ocean. So the European ships were not built for the Indian Ocean. They were built for the Atlantic, which was different in many respects from the Indian Ocean. So it's kind of general inferiority and particular inferiority in being adapted to Indian Ocean environment. So that's on one side, kind of this kind of cluster of factors that talk about technological advantage. I don't find them anywhere in the literature. With respect to the willingness to use violence, it is correct to some extent. It's highly kind of politically and ideologically laden question whether Europeans were more violent than others or not. I don't want to risk my head by taking a clear position on this question. I think that one could see use of violence not only by Europeans in Asia, but also by Asians in Asia in different periods of time and different contexts. Kind of the Timurid violence was quite significant, maybe the Mongol one. You can see it in other respects, how a massacre of Arab and Muslim traders in Chinese ports. And so violence was there before the arrival of the Europeans, I dare saying. The Europeans were maybe more kind of aspirers of using violence, maybe because of the experience they gained fighting the Muslims in North Africa after the Reconquista, maybe because of the experience they had in the Americas. But they were weak. They were really weak compared to the Asians. No European could imagine kind of marching on Delhi or marching on Beijing. That was way beyond the imagination of any European. There were relatively few European ships in Asia. Even if the Portuguese insisted on getting license from them for traveling between ports in Asia, most Asians did not care about it and found ways to avoid this. The Europeans really became dominant in terms of use of violence as time progressed, and particularly in the heyday of imperialism in the second half of the 19th century, when the Europeans really had significant technological advantage after the Industrial Revolution in the form of steel, in the form of railways, in the form of guns, machine guns. They did not enjoy such a superiority in the 16th and 17th century.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. So let me now hand over the floor to my colleague, Professor Zheng. I'll just try and unmute him now.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hello?
Yep, we've got you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Harris. I found your talk very interesting, and I think this is one of the most fundamental questions in legal history and in corporate law as well. And I have a lot of personal interest in this subject. So I have two questions. One is, why couldn't commander sustain long-distance trade? So you mentioned that it had generally been used in several regions, but in terms of Eurasian trade, cooperation dominated. So I also saw that from your PPT, you've mentioned many factors like asset partitioning, the internal governance of the corporations. Was there evidence that any of these factors were most important? And I also wonder what is the role played by insurance in this long distance trade? So the way I think about it, it seems that the major differences between the commander and the corporation is that there's a asset partitioning arrangement in corporate law that prevent the creditors from taking back the assets of the company, but not that in the commander. But apart from that, I don't see a lot of the differences. After all, a lot of the business conducted in the form of limited partnerships. So that's my first question. The second question is, to what extent is your explanation about business organization, and to what extent is it about a lot of other things? So you've mentioned the rule of law and the ability of the states to make credible commitments. So that struck me as very similar to the explanation offered by other scholars like Asanoglu about why nations fail. That is, we perhaps need a smaller government so that the private sectors would grow, and that would generate wealth for the nations. So how would you distinguish your theory from those other explanations? And I also wonder whether you think the factors, the characteristics of business corporations that you've mentioned, including asset partitioning, the locking of capital, can be transplanted pretty easily to other jurisdictions as well. And it seems to me that it might be difficult for other states to make credible commitments, but it seems rather easy for them to adopt the corporate form. So those are my questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Very interesting questions. I try to respond as many of them as I can. So first of all, the commander did take merchants a very long way. If you look at the way in which merchant networks have functioned before the rise to dominant of the business corporation, they were well adapted to the environment. I devote time in my in the book to merchant networks, not just time, a full chapter to merchant networks. I see how I show in that chapter how the commander integrates into merchant networks in various ways, next to some other organizational solutions, such as family firms and traveling agents and things like this. But networks did well. The network I kind of exhibit in the book as the most expansive is the Armenian merchant network, which was based on New Julfa, modern day Isfahan in Iran, and stretched all the way from Manila to Lhasa in Tibet, to Amsterdam, Paris, and London, and Madras, Chennai in India, and beyond. So it's not that merchant networks based on commander cannot function. They can. What was unique about what I'm studying here is the entrance of new players into the trade. And the new players were severely disadvantaged. The new players were the Western Europeans, particularly the English and the Dutch, and they were disadvantaged compared to the Armenians, say, or Indians, or Mawari, or whatever. So once you come from behind, once you are a latecomer, you are looking for solutions that will allow you to pass the entry barriers. So the ones that innovated were the ones that did worse, came from the least advantageous position within Eurasia. So the mother of invention is often problems, difficulties, barriers, obstacles. And this is why the English and the Dutch have invented rather, let's say, than the Armenians or the Indians or many of the others. But for this, Armenian merchant networks could go for many more years, I'm sure. So this was a solution that was unique to a specific period in time and specific regions in Eurasia, but it made the difference on the long term. Now for insurance. Insurance was available in some parts of the Mediterranean and Europe before. It wasn't, as much as I know, available everywhere in Eurasia. I didn't study kind of the migration of insurance as such, third-party insurance rather than other forms of spreading of risks or pooling of risks. But as much as I know, it was available for the English and the Dutch on the level of knowing the existence of insurance. But the nature of the business was uninsurable. It was uninsurable in the senses, let's say Frank Knight is talking about, of uncertainty compared to risk. The English and the Dutch were working under conditions of uncertainties. Nothing could be priced. They were the first one to go. There was no routine trade. There was no way to calculate risks and to price risks, and insurance was out of the question. Secondly, as much as insurance is based on the ability to use ships as security or assets as security, the assets were in Asia. So they could not really serve as security because they were out of the reach of the potential insurers. So the inability to use insurance is one of the factors that forced the English and the Dutch into this innovation. Now, lock-in and limited liability. So limited liability, it might sound like a provocative argument, but limited liability was not at all a factor in this story. I published a year or two ago an article in the Journal of Institutional Economics that you are encouraged to read about the history of limited liability, in which I explain in length why limited liability was not relevant at the time. It was not conceptualized at the time. It was conceptualized for the first time around the year 1800. It was widely used in the sense that we know it today only in the 20th century. Why wasn't it relevant at the time? Because debt finance was not a major factor in the financing of the East India companies. neither the English nor the Dutch. That is, the investment was equity finance, not debt finance. They did not borrow, only on the margins, but not long-term borrowing. And they did not borrow, among other things, because of the nature of the business, because no one could price the interest in a manner that would allow to lend money to these companies. So as much as there was no insurance, there were no available loans. And this is why equity solution had to be used as the leading solution for the problem. And when you have no borrowing, when you have no debt finance, limited liability is irrelevant. Because what you risk is your investment. You cannot risk beyond your investment. You can lose everything if the ships will be lost to the monsoons or to the pirates, but you can never be called upon to pay beyond what you already invested because there are no creditors. There is no question of dissolution, bankruptcy, or creditors, so limited liability is not an issue. Lock-in was important because of the nature of the exercise, which was 2, 3, 4, 5 years long, and you wanted to create repeat voyages to Asia, so you wanted to lock the investment beyond one voyage, as I explained in detail in the book. But in order for passive investors to be more forthcoming for locking in their investment, they wanted to have the exit option. And you can always exercise the exit option if the terms of your holding of stock or shares, as they were called later on, allows you to transfer. But it's much easier to exit if there is a vibrant, active, liquid stock market. So you need, first of all, to have a piece of paper that is transferable legally, but then you have to have a market in which you can actually find a buyer for this piece of paper that we now call a stock or a share. So this existed in the Dutch Republic and existed to some extent maybe in Italy, but not widely throughout Eurasia. So I think I'll stop this now. I can elaborate more, but I think that we probably want to get some more questions. So I'll stop now.
Thank you so much. So next on the queue, another colleague, Professor Hu. I will unmute her now. There we go.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Harris, for your exciting and insightful book. I very much enjoyed reading it and recommend it to my students. And so I have one question for you today. And besides geographic, cultural, and business calculation factors, did domestic political structure, like the trade power of the ruler and the political power or status of the merchant class, and international competition between states play a vital or play a more critical role in the legal migration of early trade institutions? Thank you.
Thanks, an excellent question. I'll try to address it. By the way, just to complete the point on limited liability on the previous answer, James, if you end up having a look at my article and let me know whether you are convinced by it or not, because that's something I still kind of consider the debate with myself. So for your question, so if you look at who could prevent the importation of an institution, definitely the political ruler and the political elite are coming to mind very high on the list. And the religious leaders and religious elites are also very high on our list for those who will object the importation of any kind of either new organization or new technology. And the history of technology is full of cases in which rulers and elites prevented the importation of technologies. Kind of the printing press is one example. There are many other examples. For this project, I read some of the history of technology, of the migration of technologies, in order to get some inspiration from, and I encountered many cases. So definitely the domestic political structure is very important. Let's say the corporation, as much as the corporation, the expansion of the corporation means the opening up of some gap between, let's say, the individual or families on the one hand and the ruler on the other hand, as much as the corporation works on the sphere in between these two. And maybe the corporation is part of a kind of an emerging civic society, which is a topic about which many sociologists and political scientists are talking. It's quite clear that some rulers would not like to see the development of such a civic society. Not everybody is welcoming NGOs today, and not always non-state corporations or non-state dominant corporations are in existence. They are not in existence everywhere globally. So definitely politicians are playing a factor, and politicians sometimes just kind of pretend to import something if there's a strong demand for it, let's say from the business community or mercantile community. But the question is not whether you'll import, but whether you'll really import. Let's say the fact that the French king was willing to incorporate a French East India Company doesn't mean that the French king was willing to constrain its political powers. He did not until the French Revolution, as we know. So this is why, even though the French king introduced the business corporation, it did not function in France. And in other contexts, you see total rejection of some solutions because of their foreign origins. Maybe in Islamic settings, you don't want to have Christian influence, or at least you want to hide it, and the other way around. And there are many such examples. But you are right that once you look at long distance trade, international trade, by refusing to adopt something, you'll pay the price for it. Domestically, you can do it. But if you'll do it internationally, this means that your merchants will not be as competitive as the merchants of other countries. And if they're less competitive, maybe you cannot promote your mercantilistic policies as much as you want. Maybe you cannot collect as much tax from trade activities or tariffs from trade activities as you want. So you're definitely right that kind of jurisdictional competition could lead to harmonization. We see it in modern day, in some contexts in the modern day. You can see in the EU jurisdictional competition over incorporation, in which Britain led the way. You can see in the US jurisdictional competition in which Delaware led the way. You can see some tax shelters that compete with each other. So competition is definitely a kind of a factor that often works in contrary directions to the ones which elites and rulers are trying to kind of implement. So thanks for the question.
Oh, thank you.
We're coming very close to the end of our time. I wonder, I have many questions from the audience. I wonder, Professor Harris, maybe I'll pose two for you very quickly if you're willing to grant us a few.
I'm willing to stay. If others are willing to stay, I'm willing to stay. I'm also willing to get any questions that are left in writing and try to respond to them.
Okay, so two that I have here. The first one is, how do you identify whether an organizational structure is migratory or arose independently? And the second one is, while the Catholic Church had a foundational legal role in the rise of corporations, why did the British and the Dutch, mainly Protestant nations, take off with the commanders instead of Catholic nations?
Two great questions. The answer for the first is that it is very complicated to distinguish. And when working on my project, I worked on other types of migration, let's say domestication of animals, which was a question that bothered many for many generations, can now be relatively sorted out through examination of mitochondrial DNA. So some questions relate to, let's say, the Neolithic revolution, the question whether the Neolithic revolution took place in one place and then was copied, that is the beginning of agriculture, the movement from hunter-gatherers to agricultural settlers, did it take place in one place or in many places, can now be answered to a greater extent thanks to DNA. We cannot use DNA in our context, unfortunately. And there are debates as to different scripts, different types of systems of writing. It's easier there because there are so many details involved, and there are also physical remnants that were left and discovered by archaeologists. So much could be done with these. Unfortunately for us, in the context of organizations, the records are really minimal and are different often in different parts of Eurasia. Let's say, if you can see in Muslim environments only the text of jurists, and Italian environments only contracts that were preserved by notaries, it's very hard to decide whether the Italians copied the commander or not, because of the nature of the records, which is so different. And the challenges are great. I did my best. I think that I did not provide conclusive answers to the questions. I think that it is definitely a worthwhile exercise to take similar questions and further ponder upon them and try to tease out more convincing and more well-based answers to these questions. We can do much more. We cannot do as well as with respect to other types of migrations for which better records have been preserved. As for the question of why, if the origin is with the Roman Catholic Church, Rome, the Pope, how come that the business corporations showed up in Protestant rather than Catholic states? And obviously, Weber first comes to mind, the Protestant ethics kind of explanation of Weber. Maybe it's all about your internal calling or something like this that relates to Protestant theology. So my argument is that while I do not deal directly with Weber, my answer is connected to the political structure of England and the Dutch Republic. The fact that in the two, a nascent rule of law has emerged. And in Britain, the nascent rule of law is weakly connected to the Protestant or Anglican Reformation. Some of the beginnings of Parliament and the judiciary were there before the English Reformation. So you cannot explain the English political structure only based on the Reformation. In the Dutch Republic, it might be more strongly connected to the Reformation because the Dutch Republic was created as a federation while it was fighting its religious wars with Habsburg Spain. And because of these wars, the Dutch were creating initially a municipal debt, and then a provincial debt, and then a national or federal debt, which required the issuing of bonds to the public and the creation of a functioning stock exchange. So there is a connection between the political structure that gave rise to the Dutch East India Company and the Reformation, but the connection is not theological. The connection is more in the political structure than in the theology. And again, in Britain, I think that the same explanation holds, in my view. And the failure of France or Spain and Portugal is not because of theology, as I see it today, because there was nothing there theologically that prevented the creation of legal entities, legal personalities. It's the rulers, not the religion, that prevented the development of business corporations in these Catholic countries, in my view. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. So I know some colleagues on this end are going to have to take off at some point. So I don't want to keep you forever, but let me just pose a couple final questions, and apologies to all it's a testament to how stimulating so many found the talk that we've got many questions from the audience. So apologies to those whose questions I won't get to, but let me pose another couple pair of final questions to close off with. So the first one just pertaining to I guess, part of your conceptual framing that you mentioned early on. You mentioned you found the legal transplant literature not sufficient or unsatisfactory. Why exactly, and how is your approach different, other than just using the term migration instead of transplantation? And secondly, can your findings be translated into modern times? Are there similar developments, limited migration of institutions, legal systems that you would identify in modern times? Thanks.
Again, two very excellent questions. I apologize for speaking for so long and leaving less time for Q&A. That's part of the cause of the inability to respond to all questions. So the legal transplants literature, as it evolved around, let's say, Alan Watson and others, I don't say that it is wrong. I say that its applicability and its shaping was done in two contexts. One of them is the expansion of Roman law. First of all, the reception of common law in Europe through the Jus Commune and those developments that are unique to continental Europe, and then the expansion of Roman law with the, let's say, the Spanish Empire and the French Empire and beyond. This is one phenomenon that was relatively well treated by the legal transplant literature. The other one is the importation of the English common law within the British Empire to North America, to India and beyond. So I think that the literature was shaped by a translation from mostly from above within empires, whereas the kind of exercise that I'm doing here is the kind of exercise of trying to understand migration in much more pluralistic political environment in which you have many independent jurisdictions, migration across regions, across cultures, across civilizations, across religions, which is not done by imposition from above. And this type of migration of legal institutions of this type is not sufficiently developed. And I think that we have to develop somewhat better methodological tools for addressing this type of migration, which I find fascinating. So it's a project in the making. I'm not the only one that is involved in making this project. It will be complementary to the legal transplant project. It will not kind of replace it, but rather enrich it by adding different types of explanations to different types of transplantations. Applicability to modern times, there are for sure applications. As an historian, I tend to be hesitant in kind of pointing direct applications. I will there just maybe think three things. One of them that I've already kind of hinted to is that the migration of the business cooperation based on the English-Dutch model is not yet global. There are different parts of the globe in which business corporations, definitely domestic business corporations, either do not exist in large numbers and are a small percentage of the economy, or exist but behave differently. Behave differently, for example, in the sense that they function in states in which the credible commitment made by the rulers, by the political rulers, is not strong. We can see examples for this in recent weeks or months. You see some other parts of the globe in which maybe business corporations are more common, and maybe there is a level of credible commitment which is higher, but in fact, the business corporations are personally based. These are, let's say, business groups, which are family business groups, in which many of the investors are members of the family or are connected to the family. So even though they are in the shell, look like business corporations, they are not business corporations in the sense of impersonal corporation. So even with respect to business corporations, we still have a variety of open questions. If you look at patent law, different parts of the globe respond differently to European models of patent law. land registries, also different parts of the globe view them differently. What's called the new family is a model that some parts of the globe are willing to adopt, other parts of the globe reject altogether. And you can think of other examples for process. The main takeaway point with respect to migration of legal institutions is that the key question is not whether you are familiar with the institution. The main question, because now everybody is familiar with everything, the quick question, which still remains in force today, is whether you want to import and whether you are able to import given your general environment and general institutional structure. So knowing institutions is not a question. The question is whether there is a resistance to the importation and whether there is suitability for the importation.
Okay, so thank you so much for those answers, for an incredibly stimulating talk. I'm sure, of course, it remains for me since our colleagues are muted and mostly invisible, on behalf of them all, to express our gratitude for this talk here tonight. I mean, I found it incredibly stimulating, and I know from all of the questions I got, the audience did as well.